Have you ever thought about what is holding your faith back? What is the real enemy of your faith? I remember when I was learning to drive a car, I had an instructor when I was in town where there's a limit on the speed. And I was pressing the accelerator and I said to this instructor, naively said to him, this car, has something wrong with it. I'm pressing the accelerator and it isn't going faster. He looked at me and he said, look at my side. And he had another set of pedals. My foot was on the accelerator, his foot was on the brake. I didn't know that. Have you ever thought why there is a brake on your faith? What is it? What's the real enemy of our faith? Well, let's have a look at Mark chapter 9 and verses 17 to 29. In the first part of that chapter is the account of Jesus' transfiguration, when his glory shone through his flesh and through his clothes, and it was like the sun shining at midday. Peter, James and John were up the mountain with him and they saw this. But the other 9 disciples, to whom Jesus had given authority and power, were not able to deal with the situation of an epileptic boy. The boy was foaming at the mouth, having seizures and throwing himself in the water and in the fire. And the father hoped the disciples would be able to cast out this spirit. But when they saw, they were confronted by all the convulsions, they were overwhelmed. And what they saw was the problem, that they allowed that to quench their faith and quench their power. They couldn't do anything. So the father had a problem. And when Jesus came down the mountain, he went straight to Jesus and said, if you can do anything, have pity on us and help us. Now Jesus said to him, what do you mean, if? If you are able to believe, all things are possible to those who believe. And when he heard this, the father of the boy cried out with tears and said, Lord, I do believe, help my unbelief. Jesus then calmly cast out the demon and the boy was completely set free. Now, Jesus pinpointed the enemy. He said, help your unbelief. That is exactly right. If you can believe, unbelief is the problem. The disciples asked the Lord, why couldn't they cast out the demon? Now, if we switch over to Matthew's Gospel now, Matthew 17, you'll see exactly the same reason given to the disciples as he gave to the boy's father. Jesus gave them a clear answer to the disciples who could not cast out the demon. He said, it's because of your unbelief. Matthew 17 and verse 20. So when you're fighting an enemy, it's vital to know exactly who the enemy is. Both to the boy's father and to his own disciples, the Lord identified the same enemy. Now let's look at other situations, like the raising of Jairus' daughter. Jairus was the highly respected leader of a synagogue, and he had a 12-year-old daughter who was close to death. Now Jesus said, I'll come with you, I'll come and help you. And when he got to the house, before they got to the house, the crowds gave the ruler of the synagogue the news, your daughter is dead. Now again, reading from the Passion Translation, Mark 9, 36 to 42. But Jesus refused to listen to what they were told, and he said to the Jewish official, don't yield to fear. All you need to do is to keep on believing. And when they arrived at the house, Jesus did not allow anyone to go in except the parents, Peter, James and John. Outside there was an uproar amongst the people who were weeping and wailing because of the death. And Jesus said, why all this grief? And he threw them all outside and gently raised up the child. Now, I've shortened it a little bit because of time, but to perform the miracle, Jesus had to take into account the spirit of fear and the spirit of unbelief. No unbelief was allowed in the child's room. One more quick example. In the previous chapter, Mark 8, Jesus was in the village of Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man to him. Now, even though he was busy, Jesus took the time to lead him outside the village. He then placed saliva on his eyelids, and the man's sight started coming back. And he needed to do it a second time as well, and then he was completely restored. Mark 8:22 to 29. Now, why did he take the time to do this? He was busy. There were loads of people waiting for him to minister to them. He must have done it for a good reason. Well, Luke tells us the good reason. In Luke 10 and verse 13, Jesus had made a comment about this village. He said, "Woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the miracles that were done in you were done in other cities, they would have repented long time since." Luke 10 and verse 13. Bethsaida was a village full of unbelief. So Jesus took him out of that environment, outside of the town, and then, after the man had regained his sight, Jesus ordered him to not go back into the village. Mark 8 and verse 26. Again, why? Because of unbelief. Now, for us to receive our miracle, we have to be aware of people around us, especially our family members. In Mark 3 and verse 21, when Jesus' own family found out what he was doing, healing the sick and doing it on Sabbath days, oh my goodness, they tried to take him home by force, thinking he was out of his mind and deranged. And then again, when he visited his hometown of Nazareth, he was unable to do any great miracle. Think about that. He was the Son of God, and he couldn't do any great miracle. Why? Mark 6:6, the Passion Bible, he was amazed at the depth of their unbelief. So beware of unbelief. Beware of this sin that kept a generation of Jews out of the promised land. Check that out in Hebrews 3 and verse 12. Keep a tight check on how you are allowing yourself to think, because unbelief will certainly, if you let it, block your healing miracle. See you again tomorrow.